Welcome to the new and improved BASF Real Results Virtual Farm. We've completely redesigned the experience to better suit your needs, providing a more intuitive, easier to navigate platform to allow easy access to the areas that interest you most. Our living, breathing farm is available 24/7, come rain or shine. So swap your wellies for Wi-Fi and dive in to see some of the great features and information we've got to offer. There's a new dedicated gateway to access our virtual trials, putting real-world data and results right at your fingertips. With a new home for our virtual events, regular live webinars across a range of topics, along with catch-up content available on demand. Hear from and ask questions to experts live and register for upcoming events with ease. And if this isn't enough, with a host of other zones all packed with information and content on the areas that interest you most. Simply navigate your way into a zone of interest by hovering over it and clicking with your mouse or tapping with your finger on a touchscreen device. Once selected, you'll be transported into the zone and have access to a range of interactive content including videos, information and quizzes. Earn basis and Neuroso points in many areas too. Simply head to the user guide to find out how. There's a wealth of ever-changing content to explore on our living, breathing virtual farm. And so why not explore for yourself today?
Good morning and welcome in the BASF Real Results Virtual Farm. My name is Muriel Moy. I am the campaign manager for cereal fungicides at BASF here in the UK. As you've just seen on the video clip, we have completely redesigned our virtual farm and enriched it with new interactive content. So after the webinar, have a look around to explore the different zones and of our brand new virtual farm. This morning, we're going to talk about cereals, and with the harvest just kicking off, let's hope we'll have a high yielding year. But certainly 2021 will be a memorable year regarding disease pressure. So I'm sure most of you have been visiting trials recently and that you've seen by yourself the huge disease pressure. But the situation has changed dramatically in the last weeks and even in the last days. So we thought it was a good opportunity this morning to share with you our impressions and discuss the latest views from our trials. So let me introduce you our three speakers this morning. David Leahy is our technical fungicide expert in Ireland, and he will be covering barley. Then we'll move to wheat, covered by Dr. John Helliwell, our technical fungicide expert in the UK. And finally, Luc Pollard will explore how digital tools can form part of the toolbox for tackling diseases. Some housekeeping messages before starting. We have one basis point and one NRSO available this morning, and I'll explain you at the end of the webinar how to claim those points. This session is being recorded so that you can replay it at your leisure, and it will be available in our webinar archive. And if you have any questions during the presentation, click on the bottom left of your screen. There is an Ask a Question button, and we'll address all the questions at the very end of the presentation. So I'd like to welcome on the virtual stage our first guest speaker, David Leahy. David has a fantastic understanding of the barley crop and its challenges. This morning, he will be covering really Irish trials. So of course, everything isn't transposable to the UK situation. Disease pressure might be different and worse practices as well. But nevertheless, I'm sure we'll learn from your presentation, David. So I'm handing over to you.
I was just thanking Muriel and just relaying the messages that yes, disease pressure was high in Ireland this season. Certainly not a whole lot different to the UK, but certainly when it comes to barley, the pressure which we are dealing in is certainly higher. So really what I'd like to do this morning is just to give you a flavor, I suppose, in terms of what we've been seeing in the field and the different types of pressures which we've been coming up against. And I suppose one area which is pretty good to start on is net blotch. And certainly this is a disease which appears to be becoming more and more problematic every year. We can now accept that the SDHIs are not contributing massively in terms of the control of net blotch, with resistance now being widespread. And prothioconazole, an azole that you're all obviously aware of, and being the backbone to disease control in barley, is certainly not performing at the level which it once did. Now, absolutely, I accept that this isn't going to be an issue across all varieties, but certainly this season I received more and more of these type of images from not just from colleagues in Ireland, but equally in the UK. And if we take this variety, Propino, where you got a good application of a prothio and SDHI mix, in this case a Latacera, you can see that there was heavy striping of net blotch on that leaf, the stripe form of net blotch. And where that is becoming an issue is down to what I've just spoken about. SDHI is not contributing to the control of net blotch, and prothio certainly not doing what it once did. Really, we're now in a scenario where we need to consider strobilurins for the control of net blotch. If we take this image from Ireland, the variety being Planet, and Planet has certainly revolutionized the game over here, I would argue, in terms of the yields that we can now achieve with spring barley. But it does come with a little bit of a word of warning, and that is on net blotch. And certainly this season in Ireland, where net blotch wasn't considered within the program at T1, the punishment was pretty severe. And as you can see on this image, this crop received a prothio SDHI mix again, this time in the form of Siltra, very heavily marked with net blotch. But if we take the main crop on your screen at the moment, this crop received an SDHI prothio mix as well, but with the inclusion of Comet. And this was done through our product called Preaxor, a very, very strong barley product, and included in a mix with prothio, certainly as robust as you would get. It does have to be factored in that T1s and spring barley were delayed quite a bit over here due to weather, and there was a high level of rhynchosporium within crops. And that combination of xenium, F500 and prothio certainly covered an awful lot of bases at T1. We also need to be conscious of the fact that we're now dealing with a straw-resistant mutation in the form of F129L. And through BASF testing and independent testing across both the UK and Ireland last year, we can now confidently say that this is a mutation that is pretty widespread. Now, thankfully, we can control this mutation, as I mentioned, with F500, the backbone to that control. And certainly that's what we've seen this year, where F500 was used at T1, we achieved very, very high levels of control of net blotch. Now, it wasn't just agronomists who were stressed across the country this season. Barley crops suffered a high level of stress also. If we think back to the weather throughout March and April, all that cold and difficult weather really did not help barley crops a whole lot. These type of images were very common, and I'm sure many of you would have seen this type of effects in fields over the season. What you're looking at here is a typical crop scorch on a crop of hybrid barley. Certainly mixes with wild oat herbicides, PGRs, fungicides, spring cleanup herbicides. Those type of heavy tank mixes certainly didn't lend themselves to being kind to barley crops this season. But equally, we have to factor in the weather. And a lot of those April frosts did lead to scorch on barley crops. We saw an element of abiotic spotting coming into crops quite early also, but ultimately what all of this stress early on led to was a high level of ramularia building up within crops. Couple that with a wet May and high sunshine levels, and certainly this year was a very high pressure for ramularia. But the point is, it should not come as a surprise to us when we factor in the high levels of stress which crops went under, or which went through, should I say, early on in their life. So I've covered net blotch, and I've certainly touched on stresses which can predispose crops to ramularia. But if we move on to the main barley disease, not just in Ireland, but equally in the UK, Rhynchosporium, and this is certainly something which we can't lose sight of. Ramularia absolutely needs to be factored in, and it's a pretty good buzzword at the moment, particularly with chlorothalonil gone. But there is a direct link between improving primary disease control like Rhynchosporium net blotch, while also helping ramularia control, and that is done through stress. So we can't take our eye off the ball when it comes to Rhyncho. Now, just to give you an idea of the Rhynchosporium pressure which we suffered in Ireland this season, and this type of imagery might come as a shock to many of you, but it just demonstrates how severe Rhynchosporium can be and just the level of infestation which we are dealing with within crops. This is an untreated plot of cassia, which rates reasonable to average on Rhynchosporium, and you can see how severe it was. So this really is just framing a picture for you, just to demonstrate the level of Rhyncho we had in crops. But if we now begin to factor in treatments, okay, and these were all one-shot treatments at growth stage 37. So really testing the chemistry to its utmost in a very, very high pressure scenario. Now, I appreciate you might look at these rates and say, blimey, they're very, very high, but everything is relative here. The disease pressure which we're under in terms of Rhynchosporium is much higher than in the UK, but the data is still very, very relevant and still demonstrates how powerful certain chemistries can be. So if we take a prothio and a solatinol mix, you can see that you're achieving reasonable control on Rhynchosporium, certainly from a one-shot approach, 13% on leaf 3 and 5% on leaf 2. If we then move forward to another prothio and SDHI mix, this time in the form of Siltre, you can see that your level of control improves even further. This is largely being driven by the prothio, but certainly the SDHI is contributing a certain amount. Not all SDHIs are contributing to the same level, however. And if we have a look at this next image, and this is no prothio, this is a pure non-azole solution, and this is a liter of xemium, okay? So if you take your mind back to the previous two slides, those SDHI mixes contain prothio. This is an SDHI out on its own, in the form of xemium, achieving very strong control of Rhynchosporium in a severely high Rhynchosporium situation. But we can go one better than that. And if we look at Preaxor, that combination of xemium and F500 achieving really, really high levels of Rhynchosporium control. Let's not forget the importance of Comet, which I touched on at the beginning. You're not only covering off Rhynchosporium with T1, but equally net blotch. And a nasal-free solution, certainly what we're hearing back within BASF is that prothio is being used so extensively now across barley that there is a genuine fear out there that maybe we're going to decrease its efficacy further. And what we have here in Preaxor is a nasal-free solution. Now, the reason I talk about Preaxor is I'm over here in Ireland, obviously, and Preaxor is a product that is the backbone to disease control in barley. And it's just to demonstrate really for you on the call this morning how powerful chemistry can be, certainly in the control of Rhynchosporium. And just to put it into context on a graph form, because I appreciate the data can get a little bit lost in imagery, you can just see in Imtrex itself, you know, how strongly it's punching versus prothio SDHI mixes. Very, very powerful chemistry, and certainly something within BASF we're very, very fortunate to have. And again, if we just look at Preaxor, you know, right up there with a prothio SDHI mix in terms of the level of disease control you can expect on barley. So ramularia, and you know, if I had a pound for every time I've discussed ramularia over the past 12 months, I'd certainly be a well-off man. But absolutely all of those conversations are valid about this disease. We can't forget that we've lost chlorothalonil, and certainly this season it really came home to roost, not only in wheat but equally in barley. Chlorothalonil was the backbone of ramularia control, and certainly what we've seen over the last 12 months is we've had to adjust to how we manage the disease, and we have to now realize that effectively there is no one can solution to controlling ramularia. If you take your mind back to one of my earlier slides where I discussed stress, that's really when managing ramularia begins, right at the beginning of that crop's life. Anything we can do to take stress off a crop, let it be a tank mix or let it be managing early disease like rhynchosporium, all of this will have a positive effect on ramularia later on in the season. But nonetheless, just to give you an idea of the pressure which we've seen in Ireland last season, or this season just gone, this is from the variety Valerie. And these were images which I would have photographed in Teagasc in Oak Park. And, you know, it has to be kept in mind that these images were taken on the 4th of June. And certainly a week later, ramularia absolutely ravaged the untreated plot to the state that there was virtually no green leaf left. So this was quite early in its life, but really at the beginning of a very, very rapid movement of disease infestation through the crop. And you can see certainly on leaf 2, 20% ramularia, and even 10% on leaf 1 on the 4th of June is a very, very high level of ramularia, but just demonstrates how problematic that disease was this season. And if we look at a treatment, and again, a prothio-SDHI mix, this time in the form of Siltra, we can see that we've achieved quite a good level of control on this, on this disease. Now, it does need to be kept in mind that if I showed these images, or if I had photographed these images a week or 10 days later, they would be very, very different. But certainly early on in that disease cycle, Siltra in this case did appear to offer a reasonable level of control. But when we go up through the gears and we look at how powerful Revasol is on ramularia, you can really see that it had a very, very positive effect. Now, looking at the percentages, you might say, David, that doesn't seem massively different to Siltra. But what needs to be kept in mind is that these are images from a moment in time. And certainly a week to 10 days later, the Revasol plots are still remaining very, very green versus the prothio-based treatments. Now, this is nothing whatsoever to do with SDHIs. This is all down to the azole and the sheer strength of methyltrifluconazole on ramularia. I mentioned that, you know, growers and advisors and agronomists are looking for prothio free solutions or non-prothio based solutions, and certainly Revasol at T2 is a very, very strong solution. Over here in Ireland this season, certainly at T1 we based a lot of our mixes around the likes of Praxor, as I mentioned, plus prothio at T1, and at T2 was where Revasol really fitted in. We knew that we were going to have a high ramularia pressure year of all the levels or of all the stress which the crops went through at the beginning of their life, and certainly Revasol fitted in very, very well at T2 and did offer a very good solution on ramularia. So certainly, you know, within BASF, we feel we have strong solutions across the full range of timings on barley now. And certainly, you know, in this case, in the form of ramularia, Revasol being the market leader solution in that regard. Thank you, Muriel.
Thanks, David, for that very comprehensive overview on barley. And I think it's reassuring to see that even under such high disease pressure, there are strong solutions to control the diseases. So thanks a lot for that. We will now move into wheat, and it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. John Halliwell. John, I guess you've been pretty busy traveling those last weeks, monitoring our fungicide trial. So let's now hear from you. Over to you, John.
Yeah, thank you, Muriel. So yeah, thanks for the introduction. Great overview of barley, David, in the UK and in Ireland, and then implications for the UK as well. And I think what I'd like to do, there's been a lot of discussion particularly over the last 4 or 5 weeks, I'd say, where people have attended demonstration events, whether they be BASF events or other events. And there's been a lot of discussion this year around disease control, particularly septoria, and the level of control that's been achieved this year. And what I'd like to do is just start the presentation with this. And we've seen this before. These are the fungicide performance curves. So as we came into 2021 and our decision-making process from fungicides, obviously these are utilized quite extensively as part of the decision to inform what we will apply primarily at T1 and T2. And clearly we came into 2021 with the view that Revastar XE and new entrant Univoc are a clear step ahead now in terms of septoria from these trials. But these trials were generated between 2018 and 2020, 3 typically quite low disease pressure years. And what a contrast that's been to what we've achieved, what we've had in 2021, one of the highest septoria seasons that's been on modern record. A huge septoria pressure. So what we wanted to do, just for those of you that couldn't join us face to face at any of our demonstration events, is just to give a snapshot really of what we've seen in trials this year, some of the preliminary learnings. But obviously we've got to take this for what they are. The most important assessment is still to come in terms of yield. But I think there are some interesting things that we've observed in trials this year. And clearly our ability to control the disease in 2021 has been challenged, and it's a completely new era. And the first point in that is CTL, and the loss of chlorothalonil has had a fundamental impact on our ability to understand disease control with certain products. You know, we've relied quite heavily on chlorothalonil throughout our whole fungicide program, and as the first year where we haven't had this available to us, it's been quite eye-opening actually how different our disease control strategies are, and some of the tweaks that we may need to take going forwards. And compounded with that was the weather. Clearly in agriculture, the weather is always a key driver behind our decision making. But as we came up to the T1 period, so the kind of March, April type period, we came into March where it was very cool, typically quite dry. And as we came into April, again, very, very cool conditions and very, very dry. And this created a lot of discussion in the market around septoria in particular, how much septoria was currently in crops, whether it be visual, whether it be in the latent phase. And the conclusion that the majority of people came to was that septoria pressure was very low. And as a result of that, the intensity of T1 application, whether it be choosing a slightly weaker product or whether it be reducing the dose of that product, the intensity overall of the T1 application was often reduced. And what's compounding that was timings. Now, as an R&D manufacturer, you know, we have a number of trials across the UK, whether they be for registration trials of new active ingredients, whether it be for development of current chemistry, whether it be looking at the performance in the market of current solutions that BASF have got to offer, like Revastar. But what's interesting is we can look at these trials and we can benchmark year on year different aspects of these trials. So what we've got here is an indication of when T1s and when T2s were applied. And we can compare 2021 trials to 2020 and 2019. So on the screen here is an indication of T1 applications across the BASF UK trials network. And what we can see is these trials in 2019, you know, T1 applications started on the 15th of April. And then as we move up, we're completing more T1 applications on a greater number of trials. And T1 applications ended on the 22nd of May in BASF UK trials in 2019. And we can compare that to 2020, and we can compare it to 2021. And what we notice is 2021 was towards the right of the typical over the last 3 years. So actually T1 applications were made slightly later in BASF trials. And I think this is representative of what's happened on farm. But what's interesting is as we look towards T2 there, So if we do the same process for T2 applications, so in 2019, T2 started on around the 10th of May, and they ran right through until probably the 9th or the 10th of June. 2020 was very, very similar in terms of application dates, but then 2021 was far later. Applications didn't start until towards the end of May, and they ran right through into June. And so what we can see here is the gap really between T1 and T2. And if you compare that between the previous 2 years, typically you're looking at around a 3-week gap, so a 20-day gap in BASF UK trials between T1 and T2 in 2019 and 2020. But you can see in 2021, that was pushed, and it was nearly a month, nearly 4 weeks, as the average time between T1 and T2 applications. And there are instances on farm in certain areas where that gap was 5, if not 5.5 weeks. And what that does is it's put a lot of pressure in 2021 on leaf 2, but also on the emerging flag leaf, because flag leaves did start to emerge and then it slowed in that cool weather that we had. And so actually leaf 2 and particularly the flag leaf were untreated for a large period of time in 2021. And that may go some way along with chlorothalonil and along with some of the weather aspects in explaining why some of the disease pressures were as we saw. So what I'd like to do is just go around a couple of our real results farms. So we've got a national network of demonstration sites, and we've actually got 7 nationally this year, spanning the UK, different disease pressures, different geographic locations. And at these farms, we look at varieties, we look at fungicide performance and different program performance across different agronomic scenarios. And what I'd like to do is just focus on a couple of examples from Rawcliffe Bridge in Yorkshire, from Great Chew in Oxfordshire, and from Hercott in the southwest, just to give a range of different scenarios that you as growers may have experienced this year. And the first example was from Great Chew, and this was a photo taken on the 28th of May, so it was immediately before T2s were applied at this site. And what we can see here is skyfall. So you've got untreated skyfall on the left, and unsurprising with skyfall, we've got some yellow rust scarring just starting to come in. And we know now, the BASF message has been with yellow rust, the easiest and the most structured way to keep on top of yellow rust is a programmed approach and controlling it early. So utilising a T0 where appropriate, and utilising robust timings and robust products. Now, at this site, there was extays in the surrounding fields, so this didn't receive a T0 application. But where we've just applied 0.75 Revastar, 0.75 litres per hectare of Revastar at T1, you can clearly see the benefit that that's had on yellow rust, and it's a clear opportunity really to control yellow rust with the combination of Revasol and in particular Xemium within that mix. And actually both actives contributing on yellow rust. And this isn't new. We've seen it, for a number of years now that Revastar is a strong product on yellow rust. But clearly the opportunity for yellow rust, particularly where pressure is higher, is to control it early with any fungicide. And the inclusion of a T0 or the inclusion of something like F500 can benefit any fungicide program in a high yellow rust scenario. But I think we can take from this that, Revastar clearly has a good level of activity on yellow rust. And just to make that slightly clearer, so here we've just removed leaf layers from those previous plots. So it's the same time, 28th of May, and you can clearly see the visual difference in yellow rust control right down to leaf 4 from that application of a T1 0.75 litre per hectare of Revastar XE. But I think it's fair to say that yellow rust on the whole as a national picture probably isn't the dominant disease of discussion at the moment. And clearly septoria has entered crops very, very quickly. And what's really interesting is when we're looking at trials, and in particular when we're doing demonstration events, actually on the 1st of July at Rawcliffe Bridge, so our trial in Yorkshire, and these photos are courtesy of Matt Barnes and Ali Ona, who are the two BASF representatives at that site and demo managers. And this is a crop of untreated barrel. And on the 1st of July, there was septoria in barrel, but it was very, very subtle, I'd say. And actually, it was quite difficult to differentiate at this timing between fungicide programs. And so where we're viewing demonstration sites mid-June onwards, really, the differences in product performance in particular were quite subtle and quite varied at this point. But whereas in 2020, we had an ingress of Septoria very, very late, so typically 6 to 8 weeks after the T2 was applied, in 2021, Septoria came far earlier. So despite all of the suggestion that there was very limited Septoria inoculum at that timing, clearly there was Septoria in these crops. And as we move forward at Rawcliffe Bridge, so just 4 days later, the 5th of July, you can clearly see Septoria starting to move its way up the canopy. And if you move 11 days later, so the 12th of July, Septoria has really taken hold on this untreated barrel here. And that's not surprising given the variety, and you would go into a season with barrel knowing that it was a risk from Septoria. But what is interesting is within an 11-day period, we went from very, very clean flag leaves and leaf twos to almost a completely senesced and dead crop from the Septoria attack. So it came in very, very quickly, despite this perception that Septoria inoculum was low in the slightly earlier season. And again, so what we've done here is we've looked at a similar time point, so the 6th of July, the 12th of July, and the 15th of July. And we're looking at comparisons now between fungicide programs. So you've got untreated crops here at all 3 time points. And again, you can see at the same site, you can see the progress of Septoria in these crops. And this won't come as new to anyone that's seen some of these trials. But I think even at that 6th of July timing, it was quite difficult to pull apart differences in product performance. If we look at Astra here, so this was a T2 only application, and so it didn't have a T1 across these plots at all. So this is a really hard test against Septoria. And if we look at 1.2 litres of Astra here as a T2 application, you can start to see some differences, but they're very, very subtle at this stage from the photos that we've got here. And actually 1.2 litres of Astra and a litre of Revastar at this timing performing relatively well compared to the untreated. There are some subtle differences coming in, but this was typical of when many people view trials. And actually the kind of ranking was changing daily, and the performance of products was changing daily at this point. If we look then to the 12th of July, so exactly the same plots, just 6 days later, and you can start to see how Septoria is entering some of these crops now. So in an untreated scenario, there's a significant level of Septoria right up on the flag leaf, and you can start to see how some of the other products are starting to break down in terms of longevity of protection. And it's, this is a really strong test because Septoria enters these crops so aggressively that it's unsurprising really to see that a single application is starting to struggle in certain scenarios. And then if we go to the 15th of July, so 9 days after the first photos on the screen, and again, it just continues to pull apart differences. So we know about the longevity of Revastar. We've proven that over the last 3 or 4 years now in trials. The depot formulation and then the redistribution within the leaf of Revasol does create this long-lasting protection. So in a higher pressure season in 2021, this reinforces our understanding and our ability to look at this as a key opportunity really to use Revastar when we've got a very uncertain weather period following periods of application of a fungicide. So we've been in Yorkshire, and I'd now like us to go to the opposite corner of England. So now we're in Hercott, we're in the southwest. And what was really interesting at Hercott this year is as you'd expect, the southwest bred Septoria quite successfully this year. And here we've got some photos from that slightly later timing, so on the 13th of July. And what we've got on screen here is a crop of KWS X-Days, one of the strongest varieties on the recommended list for Septoria. And there's been a lot of talk around varieties and varieties particularly with Cougar in the parent line and how it's broken down Septoria. But what was quite clear in Hercott was actually the level of Septoria pressure that was infecting all varieties, regardless of their parent line and regardless of their lineage. And actually here we've got one of the fundamental building blocks to an IPM control strategy for Septoria in X-Days. And stronger varieties should definitely be utilised within programs to limit the speed at which Septoria develops in a crop. But what we can see here is a completely untreated scenario, and you can see the level of infection that Ixtasa's got as one of the stronger genetics on the list. And what we've done is we've put the same T2 across these treated plots. So here we've got 0.46 litres a hectare of Proline 275 as a T1, and then we've used a litre a hectare of Revastar at T2. And you can see that fungicide performance has been relatively successful in controlling Septoria, but certainly at the base of the canopy on the 13th of July, there is clear Septoria, and that Septoria has moved up. And even despite the flagleaf spray being a litre a hectare, there are visual Septoria lesions present, and there were at Hercott on the 13th of July on that flagleaf and that leaf 2. But it's worth bearing in mind that leaf 2 will have been untreated for quite a significant period of time here. So it's a real test of T2 chemistry. What was interesting though is as you increase the intensity slightly of the T1, so this was a Laticera here applied at T1, the same T2 spray. And although the base of the crop looks very similar, and there is clear Septoria in the base, what's noticeable is as you add Salatinol as an STHI, and as you increase the strength of the T1 in 2021, the level of performance on the flagleaf has actually improved, and leaf 2. So there's less Septoria on the flagleaf and leaf 2 by increasing the intensity of your T1 in 2021. And finally, here is a picture of where we've applied Revastar at T1. So instead of Proline or Laticera, we're now applying 0.75 litres a hectare of Revastar XE at T1, followed by the same T2 of Revastar. And what we can see is a cleaner base, which you'd expect from a stronger T1, but actually a reduction in Septoria on leaf 2 and leaf 3. So the stronger T1 in 2021, despite the fact that there was wide reports of minimal Septoria, if not any Septoria at all, in the latent phase, there's clearly a strength of applying a stronger T1 in 2021, both controlling disease on the lower leaves when it came in, but also reducing the inoculum transfer up to leaf 2 and the flagleaf. And I think as a key learning out of 2021, that strength of T1, regardless of what we're currently seeing in the crop, is a key factor to take from this season. So as BASF, really, we entered 2021 really talking about risk. What is the role of a fungicide? What's the economically efficient dose of Revastar to be applying at T1 and T2? How flexible are products in terms of application timings? And understandably, some people are walking their crops, particularly in that June period, and they're challenging their fungicide approach. They're challenging the success of their fungicide approach against both Septoria and yellow rust. And that's quite a healthy thing to do. We're spending on fungicides, they need to be justified. But what's worth bearing in mind is there was a really intense discussion at that early timing around Septoria, and that Septoria, whether it be in the latent period, whether it be visual. And I think the conclusion that was drawn by many is that, and it may have been right, that Septoria was not present in those crops or at very minimal level. But I think, and as a result of that, the strength and the intensity of the T1, whether it be through a reduced rate or a reduction in the strength of a product, will have been reduced. But it's worth bearing in mind that, when we apply a fungicide, we're controlling disease for the following weather. And until we can get disease forecasting more appropriate, actually what's currently in the crop is on the basis of 2021 learning of marginal gain at the moment. It adds to a decision-making process, but we shouldn't place too much emphasis on that. And I think some of the learnings from Hercott in particular around the T1 approach was quite eye-opening actually in 2021. And it's something that we'll explore once the full data set's back. But compounded to that was this gap between T1 and T2. And you can't predict that gap when you apply your T1 fungicide. And actually that may have increased the pressure on that T1 chemistry, and particularly increased the pressure on that untreated leaf 2. And that untreated leaf 2 will have been untreated for a significant period of time, and inoculum will have built up within that leaf. And that's why we're starting to see Septoria express as we have done. Just the next point, please, if possible. And we know that the historic use of CTL has really masked differences in fungicides over the last, well, since CTL has been around. It was a very, very successful Septoria product. And actually, we need to now look at programs and the strength of programs required without CTL. And certainly some of the more conventional chemistry that's been widely utilized may need to be tweaked slightly in terms of how we use it to get success, because CTL clearly has added an awful lot to historic control programs that we've missed in 2021, and we will continue to miss going forwards. And I think the final piece is around wheat genetics. And there's clearly a developing story around wheat genetics. There's a lot of discussion around Cougar and the impact that will have. But certainly from a UK perspective, there are clear examples of where genetics outside of Cougar have really struggled in 2021. And some of the strongest varieties on the RL that don't contain Cougar have really struggled for Septoria just because of the season. So I think there's a good discussion piece to be had, and it's a healthy debate to have. But I certainly think it's a developing story, and it's not something that we can draw to conclusions on too early around genetics. And it's something that we can continue to explore as an industry, because it's not quite as simple as potentially as it may seem at current. And actually, when we look around weather, we've actually learned very little this year about some of the products that we're selling. Products are performing as we'd expect across our trial network. Nothing that I'm seeing is really telling me that there's been any fundamental shift in performance of any products at this stage. There's just been a shift in disease pressure. And actually, the message that weather following that fungicide application remains the key risk factor. Knowing what's in the crop at the time of application is of interest. But actually, until we can get better forecasting models and prediction models of disease, the weather following fungicide application is what will dictate fungicide programs. And that's the key learning from 2021, really. And when we look at when we look at Revastar and performance in trials, it continues to be the standard for Septoria control. Yes, there's new chemistry coming on the market that looks very good, and can be explored. But actually, Revastar continues to be that standard and continues to set the benchmark for Septoria performance. So with that, I'll pass back to Muriel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thanks a lot. I think this is really great to have that level of information almost live from the field. But now we need to be patient, and we need to wait for the yield data to get the full pictures. Thanks a lot, John. So John has presenting to you some of our trials. But if you want to have a look on other trials, we have set up in the virtual farm dedicated web pages to access our local demo sites. So you'll see in a minute a short clip presenting the new cereal fungicide zone, which is really focusing on trials.
Welcome to the cereal fungicide zone, your go-to destination to protect your cereals from fungi. Hear and interact with experts at our funginars. Take virtual trial tours to explore real-world data. Or dive into our demo sites to see how our products perform in the field. Interact with quizzes or view a range of informative videos with Fungi TV. So dive in today and learn more about Revastar XE and how it can protect your crops.
So now we're going to hear from Luke how digital tools can offer to tackle cereal diseases. So it's over to you, Luke.
Thank you, Muriel. Thank you. That was really interesting so far. So hello, I'm Luke Pollards, and I'm the xarvio implementation lead in the UK. xarvio is BASF's digital farming toolset, and I'm going to share with you how the features within the xarvio Field Manager tool can support you with an effective integrated approach for disease management. So firstly, what is xarvio Field Manager? So Field Manager is a digital solution aimed at helping growers and agronomists optimize their crop production and in-field activities during the whole season, from seeding right the way through to harvest. Field Manager is available on your web browser on the computer, and it's also available as a mobile app. Both applications access the same data via the cloud, so you always have Field Manager updates and insights at hand, whether that's in the field or in the office. So as of spring of this year, Field Manager is being used on over 2,500 farms by growers and agronomists. So in order for Field Manager to provide the field-specific agronomic insights, it needs to understand some basic information about your farm. So when you're setting up your farm, your fields and your cropping in Field Manager, as a user, you need to input the location of your field. So what crop and variety was drilled, what was the drilling date, and some information around the cultivation. So xarvio then uses this information to drive the agronomic computer modeling so it can provide alerts and insights throughout the season. So the first feature that I wanted to highlight that can support with disease management is called Spray Timer. Spray Timer can assist you in finding the best timing for your fungicide applications. And to do this, xarvio uses agronomic data modeling to provide an application timing alerts. These alerts are unique to your field and your situation, and are based on the information that you've entered for your field, as I've just discussed. And Spray Timer provides insights such as growth stage tracking and forecasting for your crop, and also disease risk scores for cereals, which indicate when a crop is more likely to be susceptible to a disease. So I've actually been out to one of our demo fields recently, so that I could share with you the Spray Timer insights that xarvio has provided for that field throughout the season and the spring.
So we can see on this board, we're looking at an example field at Roycliffe Bridge, which we have in the Field Manager system, and this field is just behind me. This field was drilled with KWS barrel towards the end of September, and as we look down the board, we can see the different insights and information provided by xarvio. So at the top, we can see the weather data, and looking at this weather data, it represents really well what we saw across most of the country. A very dry, cold April, followed by a more mild but much wetter May. And we can actually see here we had 52 millimeters of rainfall on this field at the first week of May, followed by some significant amounts in the following weeks as well. So if we move down one level, we can see the growth stage predictions and tracking provided by xarvio Field Manager. And the computer models which drives this is looking at a range of factors, including the weather data, but also looking at the field and crop specific characteristics and the drilling date there. So we can see at the beginning of the end of March, xarvio predicted the crop started to stand up. We reached growth stage 30, and then growth stage 32 on the 26th of April, and growth stage 39 with the flagged leaf fully emerging being predicted around the 26th of May. And this actually lined up really well with what we were seeing in the field, and we can see that because the T1 application went on just a couple of days after xarvio was predicting growth stage 32 and that leaf 3 being fully emerged, and the T2 application went on just 2 days after when xarvio was predicting growth stage 39 there. If we look down one more level, we can see the disease risks and the infection events predicted by xarvio. We can see at the beginning of spring, or actually towards the end of March, we can see the yellow rust pressure starting to increase, but the T0 application provided some good protectivity there, and we can see that represented by the purple spots. Coming up towards T1, we can see the risk for septoria was increasing as we saw some infection events there, likely driven by the rainfall that we saw. And we can see the T1 provided a good level of protectivity for a good couple of weeks. And moving towards T2, we saw the risk of yellow rust and septoria still persisting, but the T2 application again providing a good level of protection.
So you can see there how the spray timer feature can help you to apply your fungicide in a more sustainable way with a digital approach based on your specific field, the weather conditions in that experienced by that field, and the disease pressure on your crop. So also to add, as a user, xarvio Field Manager is working with you, taking on board the observations you make during your field walking, like the current growth stage of the crop and the current in-field disease pressure that you're seeing. So once you enter these observations into the system, Field Manager will take them into consideration, and they'll have an influence on the data modeling. And this allows you to further tailor the agronomic insights to your specific field situation. So a second feature within Field Manager that can support with disease management is called zone spray. The zone spray feature ensures that you can use the optimal application dosage for every part of your field. And it does this by utilizing variable application technology. So Field Manager provides biomass map data from satellite imagery for each field within the system. And in turn, Field Manager analyzes the biomass imagery to determine which areas of the field are growing more successfully and which areas less successfully. So depending on this, the field is automatically split into different field zones based on the development of the crop. So you then decide what application rate you want to apply in each of the different zones of the field, of course, within the legal limits. So an example, for a fungicide application, you can apply a higher rate where your crop has more biomass and more clean leaf area. And you can create these application maps for seeding, for fertilizer, and for crop protection applications. And then you can take these application maps over to your terminal of your machinery using a USB stick or wirelessly. So using both the spray timer feature and the zone spray feature means that your applications, your fungicide applications, will be applied in the most sustainable and effective way, applying them at the optimal time and tailored to exactly where they're needed. So you can see here how digital can form a really important pillar in a wider disease management strategy.
If we move on, and finally, as we're moving close to harvest time, I wanted to just take a couple of minutes to show you how you can get the most out of your harvest data and your yield maps by using xarvio Field Manager. With Field Manager, you can upload and analyze your yield maps and plan for next season with your yield maps. So I've actually taken a short recording of the live system, showing you how you can upload your maps and use the analytics functionality in there.
I can select the field which I've been working with, which is barn field, and I can then analyze my different field data layers. And you can also upload different field data layers as well. So I can upload a variable seeding map, for example, here. I can upload a yield map for my combine, or it could be a variable application map for fungicide, for example. I've actually already uploaded a yield map, so let's open this one up again. And you can see, actually, by looking at this data in a bit more detail, that it's been split up into 5 zones. And on the lowest zone, there's yields as low as 1 tonne per hectare, but it's going as high as 6 tonnes per hectare. I think this was obviously a difficult season with a crop that was drilled late in the 2019-2020 season, and that's reflected in the yield that we can see here. What I can then do in the analytics tab at the top left is I can bring in my management zones, which I've already set. So I can bring in my trial tramline, for example, and then I can then analyze that tramline in more detail and see what the average yield is and compare that to the overall average yield of that field. So I can see it's 4.6 tonnes per hectare. So as well as using these management zones, I can compare my map side by side. So in this example, you can see my screen is now split up into 2. I've got my yield map on the left-hand side. And what I can actually do is bring my power zone map which, as I've said, is the historical biomass average. And I can put that on the right-hand side and directly compare them side by side. But you may choose to do this with your variable seeding map, for example, or a variable application.
Perfect. And so that was just a quick demo of how you can utilize your yield maps in the Analytics tab within xarvio Field Manager. So before I hand you back to Muriel, I just wanted to share with you where you can find out more information about xarvio and xarvio Field Manager on the Real Results Virtual Farm. So if we look at this clip now I'm sharing, you can see where you can access the xarvio section zone here, zone 10. So if we go in here, there's various different resources and activities and videos you can engage with. You can even watch me introduce the zone if you like. But if you go into the Discover Field Manager section, I just wanted to highlight a really useful resource here, which is the Field Manager Interactive Demo. So this is acting as an offline version of Field Manager, looking at what Field Manager would be telling you as a user during the spring. So this is looking at that timing between T1 and T2, around that growth stage of the crop. And on this interactive demo, there's lots of additional information points, so you can read and understand more about what the different features are telling you. And then once you've done that, you can explore through the system as well in an interactive way. So you can really then explore the system before going and creating your own accounts. We've also got our previous xarvio webinars uploaded here for you to watch again from earlier on in the spring. And we've also got some video blogs here, some in-field video blogs that we took throughout the spring, which highlight the different xarvio features from the xarvio Field Manager and the xarvio Scouting products. Yeah, so please go onto the virtual farm and explore the xarvio zone for more information. So now I'll hand you back to Muriel. Thanks everyone for your attention.
Thank you very much, Luke. I think it's really great to see concretely the xarvio feature that can help tackling diseases. I will now open the Q&A and ask our three speakers to come back on the stage. The first question I have, I think, is for John. I'm asked if we have any trials in Scotland, and if yes, where, and how can we visit them?
Yeah, so good question. So yeah, we do. Typically, I'd urge you to get in contact with your local agronomy manager, which I'm sure you already contact. So either Neil Thompson in the Moor Borders area or Scott Mill. We've got trials. Neil's actually got a demonstration platform at Edington Mains, which has been a very successful platform this year. Slightly north of there, we've got trials just north of Edinburgh, so in the Kinross sort of area, quite a significant number of trials there, actually wheat and barley. I was actually there at the start of this week looking at some of these trials, and there are good differences, but what I would say is we may be towards the end of gaining visual data from those sort of trials now, but certainly there will be data fed through both Neil and Scott that you can tap into really to gain that understanding of product and variety interaction this year. No problem.
Perfect. Thank you, John. I have several questions around barley, so I think I'm going to start with you, David. We've seen the disease pressure was higher than previously, so how the farmers in Ireland have adapted to that season?
Yeah, it's a good question, Muriel. And I suppose the first thing which we were aware of this season was we knew we were entering into a year without chlorothalonil. So at the beginning of the season, growers were very, very conscious of trying to mitigate the threat of ramularia early on. They understood that there was no one-can solution. So a program was certainly developed very, very early on in the season to counter that through mitigating crop stress, etc. Now, obviously, the weather threw a spanner in the works in April. And then obviously we had a very, very wet May. And what that led to was an enormously high Rhynchosporium pressure year, even by Irish standards. It was very, very high. Thankfully, we had very, very strong artillery in our toolboxes. And I suppose what we did do was we went a little bit more robust with our T1s this season. again, just to take the pressure off that T2 and to try and get on top of Rhynchosporium pressure early. The second point I would make, I suppose, is in relation to varieties. And obviously there's an awful lot of talk about cougar genetics in wheat, etc. at the moment, but certainly in barley, you know, we're very much a divided market over here. In terms of winter barley, you have your hybrids, which are obviously very, very strong on Rhynchosporium. You know, and certainly, you know, they were very, very useful this season, particularly where we had a high Rhynchosporium pressure year. But then you look at spring barley, where our market is dominated by RGT Planet, and you know, that has net blotch issues as well. So really, I suppose what growers did do was they were aware of the threat that Ramularia posed early in the season, while also being aware of their varieties. And to be honest, Muriel, the programs were tailored accordingly, like they were every year, but certainly the intensity of that T1 approach this season was increased.
Thank you very much. John, same question around barley for the UK. I mean, how has been the situation for barley diseases so far in the UK?
Yeah, so I'd say similar to wheat, early season. So disease pressure at a national level was relatively low early. I'd say Rhynchosporium did come into crops, and clearly crops were under stress at that early timing. What's been very, very apparent in more recent weeks is the ingress of Ramularia, and particularly where programs weren't effectively controlling that primary disease early, or where stress got on top of the crop early through different means, as David explored in his presentation, really. And Ramularia has entered crops quite aggressively in the last couple of weeks. In different areas, and obviously the weather is quite conducive to that at the moment, so it's one to monitor. But I'd say that mainly Rhynchosporium and more latterly Ramularia would be the two key diseases this year on a national picture.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. Still on barley, Luke, what does xarvio offer in terms of features specifically for barley?
No, thanks, Muriel. So within the system, within the field managed system, you can add winter barley and spring barley into the system as you're cropping. So when you've drilled it in your field, you can add that against the field in xarvio Field Manager. If you do that, then as you move throughout the season, this spring, you'll receive the biomass data from the satellite imagery, and as a result, you'll be able to observe the in-field variability from that data, and where you see areas of the field that have grown better or not grown so well. And you can also then see how that crop is developing throughout the season and how that biomass is increasing. As well as that, you'll receive the agronomic modeling, so the growth stage tracking and forecasting, and the disease risk models for both winter barley and spring barley. And what was really exciting this year and this season just gone, this was the first season that we had these models active in spring barley. So what's really great is we're constantly developing and adding more features into the system to suit the needs of our users.
Great to know. Okay. And probably a last question still on barley for you, David. You've talked about the stresses and what can be done concretely to minimize those stresses?
Yeah, and it's a good question, Muriel. And I suppose, you know, the first thing we can look at is just being conscious of when we actually apply plant protection products to barley crops. And secondly is just to have one eye on the weather. If you think back to April this year, there was a lot of late season frosts. And certainly those late season frosts coupled with pretty hefty tank mixes would have led to a high level of stress on crops. But equally, you know, when one thinks of stress, one has to be very conscious of primary diseases, as I like to call them, the likes of your Rhyncho and net blotch, and certainly controlling them early. You know, you are mitigating plant stress late on. Obviously then nutrition, getting all your basics right, really, Muriel. And what I would also say, Muriel, is and this is, I suppose, more in relation to chlorothalonil and what that would have achieved. You know, we really have to accept now that we're not going to be able to achieve that level of perfection which chlorothalonil offered us in ramularia. But equally, what I would say is that we actually don't need to reach that level of perfection, because there does come a stage in a barley crop's life when you can actually accept ramularia into it. You know, certainly after the grain fill period, you know, we really don't, you know, need to have such a high level of green leaf area extending late in the season, because ultimately the crop will never ripen. So even though, you know, there is an awful lot of concern around ramularia, we do have the chemistry at our disposal to control it. Certainly we're not going to get that same level of perfection which we did from chlorothalonil. What we do have is going to get us far enough, I think, is the point.
Thank you, David. Now moving to more specific question for Xarvio, Luc. It's been a challenging season, so how accurate have the models within Xarvio been this season in 2021?
Oh, that's a great question, Muriel, and yes, it's definitely fair to say it's been a challenging season in terms of the weather that we've had across the country, and also that level of disease pressure. I would say that on the whole, the feedback that we've received from our users and what we've seen in our trials has been very positive. The growth stage models have been consistently strong over the last few seasons, and even this year, where the weather meant that the crops moved quite slowly at the beginning of spring, we saw that growth stage tracking was reacting to that weather and was reflecting the crops that were moving slowly. So that went really well. And in terms of the disease modeling and alerts there as well, we saw how Xarvio also reacted to the prediction of the wet weather that it was seeing in May from the weather data, and it was therefore predicting some septoria infection events as a result of that weather forecast. And in turn, it was triggering a high disease pressure alert as we approached that leaf 3 timing. But of course, that may not have been the case for every user this season who was using Field Manager. But the great thing is that a user can interact with the Field Manager system and input their observations, what they're seeing in their field themselves. So if they are walking their crop and having a look at the growth stage and understanding what the disease pressure is there, if they do think that actually what they're seeing in the field doesn't quite line up with what Xarvio is predicting, they could input that into Xarvio as an observation, and Xarvio will then recalibrate the models, and the growth stage models, the disease models, and it will be even more accurate for the rest of the season. So no, I really encourage people to do that. Obviously, a bit late this season, but as we look into next season, to interact, to engage with the models, as they'll just be even more accurate for you.
Great, thank you. So I think it was our last question. Thank you very much to the 3 of you for your time this morning.